I just would like to introduce Dr. Anders Huseth. He is the assistant professor and extension specialist at NC State in the field of entomology and plant pathology. He's done extensive work with cotton and sweet potatoes, amongst other crops, and together with Dr. Dominic Reisick, and they have just been extremely valuable to the extension agent, to the farmers in North Carolina. And I just want to welcome you, Dr. Huseth.
Thanks, Jason. Let me share this with you. Again, thanks to Jenny and Jason for putting this together. I think this is going to be a really nice series. I'm looking forward to sharing with you a little bit of information about insect pest management, maybe not one of your foremost concerns for wheat on an annual basis, but now is the time to start thinking about a couple issues, both for the 21 crop harvest and then the 22 planting for harvest. So again, my name is Anders Huseth. I'm the extension row crops entomologist with more research responsibilities than Dominic, but I share responsibilities with him. I also cover sweet potatoes, so you might have seen me on that circuit. I'm getting a little bit more into grain pest management now, and so this is a look at what we might expect for 21. Certainly, some of these issues that we'll talk about are sort of chronic or sporadic pests, but it's good to be mindful of some of these things and issues as we move forward in the cropping season. So today's outline is really going to be focused in on, drivers of pest management decisions in grain. I think this is something of a learning experience for me. Several of you who have been farmers in this system for quite some time, this will be old news, but I did a little bit of a data exercise to get up to speed on the situation of small grains in the state and how some of those trends in production and productivity really drive pest management decisions or how we make decisions about managing some of these key insect pests. So we're going to cover two different pest groups for this talk. An old hat, which would be cereal leaf beetle, one that's been around for quite some time. I think we've got a pretty good handle on making recommendations for managing this insect. And then one of our chronic issues in the state, which is certainly the aphid complex, and then managing the disease that these aphids spread around the system, which is barley yellow dwarf virus. And a host of other different viruses. And so this talk is going to be pretty straightforward with some interesting applied angles to thinking about how your production system looks around you. So statewide wheat production. So I was curious about how the wheat acreage fluctuates in the state. And so this is National Agricultural Statistics Service data from 1909 through 2020. And I think it's interesting to note that wheat production really moves around quite a bit in the state. So we've got the annual production acreage in the orange line. That's the reported statewide average for statewide acreage for NASS from that period. And then the five-year moving average, just kind of to provide a little bit of a smooth look at what production acreage has looked like. And so what we see is there's a lot of movement in the statewide production acreage. And I think this is important to consider for pests that tend to be wheat specialists and move around in the system. We might see more issues when wheat production acreage tends to increase. I think the other part of that is really just the productivity of the system. And so here's the estimated average, statewide average for bushels per acre from 1909 through 2020. And so no surprise here, as we've improved varieties and production practices, optimized harvest technology, we see that the productivity per acre has increased drastically from, about 15 bushels per acre in 1909 through to above 55, almost 60 bushels per acre on a statewide average in 2020. So this is a real benefit and a commendation to the North Carolina farmers, really increasing the productivity per acre. But at the same time, with increased productivity comes concerns over thresholds and insect injury, pathogen injury, and other issues associated with maximizing that productivity per unit acre. So some of the things we're going to talk about today are really associated with that profit margin and your ability to withstand economic injury on that crop. The other part of the system that I'm really interested in is really how we grow wheat in the state. So I'm a geographer by nature. I do a lot of work with satellite data. And so I like looking at maps. Here's a couple different production systems where we grow wheat in the state of North Carolina. So Union County in the south central part of the state near Charlotte, Northampton County near the Roanoke River, and then Washington County in the Blacklands. And what we see from this map is varying levels of color. So the lighter shades of yellow are less intensive wheat production, where a field is only in production in 2 of 9 years, and purple is 9 of 9 years. And what we see is, like in Union County, variable field sizes from small to large, but the intensity of wheat production, no surprise here, is higher. So we see more frequent wheat production on a per field basis. When we scale over and move over to Northampton County near the Virginia border, what we see is fields are very much more separated in space. Field size on average is a little bit smaller, and the frequency of wheat production on those fields is much less. This is the cotton production area of the state that we see cotton dominating, so less wheat in the system. And then we move over to the Blacklands, and the field scale is much larger. So very large fields. However, the frequency of wheat production on these fields ranges between 2 to 3 years per field. And so the question is how do these different intensities really affect insect pests? So we're going to talk about 2 insect systems that I think are really important to consider for North Carolina. And one of those insects would probably respond to the frequency of wheat in the system at a much greater level. Similarly, the pathosystem, aphid and barley yellow dwarf system that we typically combat in this production area can be driven by frequency of wheat production in the system. So the history of barley yellow dwarf can give you insight on what your projection for disease could be in this current season. So thinking about the landscape that you produce in is really important. I think this is a different way to think about the system. So back to first principles of pest management. Really, we need to think about in wheat 2 different systems. Integrated pest management, which is focused in on monitoring and scouting of pest populations, making a decision about whether or not the population is at an economically damaging threshold and if a spray is justified. And oftentimes we're using multiple tactics like crop rotation, host plant resistance, as well as judicious use of insecticides to manage populations and suppress these insect populations below an economically injuring level. And one really nice application of this integrated pest management concept is cereal leaf beetle. This is an insect we know an awful lot about, and we can exploit its ecology to really manage this insect pest and reduce injury in the field. What we're really concerned with here with prophylactic pest management is the use of insecticides to manage either hard to diagnose pest issues like wireworms, which can be patchy in fields, or the rapid development of pest issues in the system like barley yellow dwarf, which is a widespread problem. So these issues can be typically managed with common seed treatments like neonicotinoids on seeds. So key pests for 21, we're talking about local to landscape level pests. So wireworms are a common pest, but oftentimes not economically injurious. We're looking at wireworms as small, patchy stand establishment issues in fields. At a broader scale, we're talking about cereal leaf beetle, which can infest parts of fields to entire fields and cause economic injury. And then this aphid barley yellow dwarf complex that can infest entire production systems. So these insects are widespread in nature, and they move through the production system and infest fields and then transmit the virus. So these are different scales in which we can understand pest dispersal. So talking about cereal leaf beetle as one of our integrated pest management stories, this is an insect that's very easy to predict in wheat crops in North Carolina based on temperature accumulation. So we know the adults become active around 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit annually. We have one generation of the crop or in the crop per year in which we're looking at an adult peak in wheat, which is these black dots with the yellow arrow or with the blue arrow. The adults infest the crop, they lay eggs, and then we see this really predictable peak in larval numbers after this egg laying event. We have well-defined thresholds, and pyrethroids are very effective against these pests. And so this is a good system to understand integrated pest management practices. So cereal leaf beetle in the North Carolina system. The adults emerge in March and April. They infest the crop. They lay eggs between April and May. Those eggs hatch, and then we have the very characteristic larvae that you'll oftentimes see when you're scouting your wheat field. These are the insects that dirty up pants and sweep nets and can be very easy to diagnose in the system. Those larvae then burrow into the soil, pupate, and then we have a summer generation, which are not economically injurious to wheat because it's already been harvested. So we're really focusing our management strategy right at the time point of these insects in the crop. And so what we really need to focus in on is what tools can we use to predict these pest populations in space and time. And so here's an example of some really nice work done in 2009 and 2010 by Dominic Reisig, where he looked at the incidence of cereal leaf beetle in wheat fields and determined that these insects tend to oviposit or lay their eggs at a peak accumulated degree day level of 182 degree days. And so how can we apply that? If we look at the 30-year running average of wheat or of accumulated degree days in North Carolina, we can make up this interpolated map. So all the different colors or shades tell you approximately when you would hit that threshold given a 30-year average. And so what we see is that in the southeastern part of the state, you're going to hit that degree day threshold to peak oviposition or egg laying in wheat approximately March 11th. In the mountains, that number looks more like April to May. So this is a really nice tool to be able to figure out when you might fine tune your scouting activities in this crop. So scouting for this insect really requires boots on the ground. So we need to consider that this insect is edge-based, and you need to scout many different positions in each field to make sure that you don't miss any population infestations that could be economically damaging. The protocol is 25 random tillers in each zone of 4 zones per field. So a total of 100 tillers per field. And I think this number should probably change a little bit depending on field size. Threshold is 1 larva or egg per 4 tillers. And so we basically want to focus on management in this system. So we're biasing a little bit towards larvae in this system because you would be targeting those larvae with a pyrethroid spray. We do know that the most sensitive stage of wheat is flag leaf to boot. Definitely less sensitive after heading, although those insects might be present, they're not necessarily causing economic injury after grain fill. So it's important to think about how you might deploy a scouting activity for this pest. So scouting cereal leaf beetle, again, we're talking about 4 zones per field. So here's a little example from Union County. We looked at, just where we might be producing wheat in 21. And if you were going to scout it for cereal leaf beetle, how would you split up your scouting designs? So I basically took this representative field and divided it into about 4 different quadrants of 40 to 60 acres. And as you can see, that's a pretty big swath of the land. It also made sense to look at this field from the perspective of drainage zones. And so that provided a convenient means to split up the field into 6 units in which you could sample each of the 6 units potentially in about 40-acre blocks to maximize coverage and minimize the likelihood that you would miss an infesting population, given that this field is quite large. So I think that this is really important. With some of these bigger fields, we might need to scout a few more zones, if at all possible. So the take home for cereal leaf beetle management, certainly a sporadic pest in many, many years. It's probably more of an issue towards the eastern part of the state, near the coast. Certainly prophylactic applications for cereal leaf beetles with pyrethroids adds a built-in production cost. However, they can be pretty effective because the residual activity of pyrethroids for this pest is quite good. Scouting can help eliminate unnecessary sprays and really reduce losses due to drive down with sprayers. And again, pyrethroids continue to work very well for this pest. So we're just going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the prophylactic pest management part of this equation for wheat. So aphid management in wheat is one of these systems where prophylaxis really does make some sense. So there are several different species of aphids that infest the crop in North Carolina. We're worried about a small number of these insects that tend to move around this virus, barley yellow dwarf. Scouting and identification is the first step. So aphids are characteristically difficult to identify because they're very small. However, knowing which aphid species you have is really the first step. Autumn and winter sprays and seed treatments can be really effective means of suppressing these populations and reducing the transmission of this virus. However, the later you progress into the spring, the less effective these insecticides are and the less likely you are to return economic benefit from a spray. So just a virology 101, these insects basically ingest the virus from a host plant. It moves through their midgut. It goes through moves outside of their gut, essentially, and moves into their accessory salivary gland. And then when they move and disperse to a new plant, they start feeding and ingest that virus particle into an uninoculated plant. So this is how the transmission cycle works for barley yellow dwarf. This is where we see dispersal of winged aphids between uninoculated plants and subsequent transmission of the virus among plants in a field. So scouting is really important to head off this virus transmission cycle. There are a lot of really good resources out there. Alabama Cooperative Extension put out a very specific document on barley yellow dwarf management for the Southeast. It's a little bit fine-tuned to more southerly states, but it does provide a good reference of how this virus works in the system. We do know that there are several factors that can increase risk for this disease. Certainly early planting, high aphid numbers, low seeding rates in plant populations all affect aphid population dynamics. And then environmental factors that favor aphid development in the system, late warm autumns, mild winters, warm springs, all drive the disease cycle because it favors aphid development and movement. So the question is how can we manage this insect pest in the system, knowing that they're sort of transient and they colonize the crop? There are a few different tactics which are well accepted as far as yellow dwarf management and aphid management in general. Seed treatments applied on the seed prior to planting. This is an autumn suppression, so it's not really a threshold-based system. This is why it's a prophylactic application. Neonicotinoids work very well, Cruiser, Gaucho, Nipsit. Each of these insecticides applied to a seed coat can provide an effective means for suppressing this disease. Certainly autumn and winter sprays have been shown to reduce incidence of the disease, and by suppressing aphids, we have established thresholds of 20 aphids per row foot. And especially you want to do active scouting where barley yellow dwarf has been a problem in the past. Insecticides like pyrethroids are effective. Spring sprays become more questionable as that plant exits its susceptibility stage. But again, all this is threshold-based decisions. So considerations for aphid treatment: how many aphids are present? You know, it's really important to start scouting early, knowing that disease transmission cycle begins almost immediately after crop emergence. When you get colonization events in the autumn, be out there scouting for aphids. It's really important to establish what your population density is. Does the field have a history of the problem? Is it too late to enact change? So if you're going to use a foliar program, certainly it's been shown that, you know, earlier sprays oftentimes are favorable. It becomes much more questionable to spray later in the spring. And there's been a 11-year study of this in Tennessee, really looking at barley yellow dwarf suppression and the returns on insecticides. So we've got a good idea of how this really works in our system, given the similarity in our production context. And so the biggest question is, given the amount of insects, will spray pay for itself given the wheat prices? So that goes back to that economic threshold idea. And with that, to stay on time, I'll stop there.